Come to order.
Good morning. The record reflect we are back in session. Parties and counsel are present. All members of our jury and our alternates are present. Our witness is back on the witness stand. And Mr. Doherty, you will continue your examination.
Thank you. We left off, I believe I had displayed kind of the overhead loose. 378. I just have a few more questions, Doctor. You indicated yesterday that the exclusionary match statistic that you found for Joseph McStay Sr.'s DNA on the white cord was a quandary. Recall that testimony yesterday?
Right, you said was a quandary. Okay, I don't recall saying it was a quandary.
You don't recall which suspect you guys were?
I don't recall the word quandary.
Other than an unprotected surface, do you have any explanation as to why a full-grown adult who's decomposing on top of an item would have an exclusionary match statistic, whereas an unknown, potentially touch DNA item does have a match statistic?
Well, the explanation about how his DNA may have been erased through enzymes, I understand. There could be other explanations.
And those same enzymes would also erase touch.
If the DNA was exposed to those those DNA digestion enzymes, yes.
And those come again from both the body and from the environment.
From the soil, yeah.
Now, items that were found out in the open, in the desert, would it be fair to say that a profile obtained from those items could be anyone that touched that item at any given time?
Anyone who left their DNA on it, either through direct contact, through touching, through transfer, if they're not subject to the same sort of enzymes, they wouldn't be automatically erased.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So the items outside the grave aren't subject to the same enzymes and bacteria that might erase DNA?
They are, but in less concentration. If you expose DNA to the elements, if there's rain and bacteria, moisture, the same bacteria, kinds of bacteria will come around, but not to the same intensity as those within a grain.
And similarly with regard to the bra, you examined, or truly examined, what was identified to you as 2 cups of the bra, a right cup and a left cup.
Correct.
Do you expect that the usual wearer of the bra would have left their DNA on the bra?
That would be reasonable. The DNA may have been deposited from direct contact with somebody's skin surface, from the DNA that's on the skin surface, but that DNA may have disappeared over time and not be detectable.
And if both sides of the bra cup, if there was no areas of obvious knotting or any place where 2 surfaces would be in contact and protect any DNA in there, it would be subject to all those same enzymes and bacteria that digest DNA or chew up DNA.
Right, to exposed areas that would be susceptible to the enzymes, to the fluid, to that DNA digestion environment.
I did want to cover a couple other things. I came out and visited you in Pittsburgh a couple weeks ago.
Yes, you did.
And when I arrived, and Mr. Rodriguez was with me, and Sergeant Smith was with me.
Yes, they were.
Okay. You indicated that you fed us. When we arrived, there was donuts there.
Yeah, I think there was fruit also, but the donuts were tastier.
And I did eat a donut, and as did, well, Sergeant Smith's a cop, so he ate the donut.
Just one, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
You did offer us to take us to lunch, or to at least have lunch delivered in,
Yes.
and we declined.
Yes, I also offered to take you to the Carnegie Museum of Natural History because I have a membership and you would get in free, but you chose to pay.
Okay. Yes. We declined that as well, right?
Yes.
You can't date DNA. But you can't say when DNA is deposited.
You can have a sense that there's a lot of degradation. It might be older than DNA that has less degradation, but you generally don't know when DNA was deposited.
Counsel, defense counsel asked you yesterday about the allele tape and how it's probably not appropriate to go through the allele table and pick out an allele here and compare it to a known reference. Recall that was right at the end of direct testimony yesterday.
Was that comparing we had several tables with alleles. Was that the CODIS format?
Yes, CODIS format.
Okay, thank you.
So if a DNA expert were to try to exclude herself from using those allele tables by using her own known profile, that probably wouldn't be informative.
It would depend what method they used. If they generally used probabilistic genotyping, true allele, or some other system, that wouldn't be what they would usually do because they wouldn't be using lists of alleles. If that was the method that they regularly used, it could be appropriate.
Doctor, can you say with any degree of certainty that the DNA probabilistically analyzed on the items that you got is representative of items as they were put into a grave 3 years, 9 months before they were found?
No, I can't because we know that there were bodies and enzymes and bacteria and soil. So certainly the DNA on any exposed surfaces wouldn't even be present or be expected to be present.
And
Anything on regret?
So, what you're saying is, if, let's just say the district attorney came up to a witness and said, here's the allele list made for a CODIS entry, okay, or compiled by cybergenetics, can you eliminate yourself from that list by looking at your profile? And the objection, everybody, the DA makes her do it.
I'm sorry?
The DA makes her do it. You're saying that's improper if it wasn't done by probabilistic genotyping.
I'm saying I wouldn't do it that way because I would use a computer. Other people might do something in a different way.
So if the person that processed the items through an MBAC, are you familiar with an MBAC?
Yes.
If the person who processed the items through an MBAC collected the filters, shipped them up to Bodie, and Bodie was able to analyze those and give the digital data to cybergenetics. If the person collecting or processing the items with an MBAC, if they contaminated that sample, would you expect their profile, or would it be consistent with your understanding of DNA and degradation that their profile could have been mixed into the results you saw after your interpretation analysis?
Well, it would be theoretically possible, but from the evidence items that we saw, there were multiple contributors for all but one of them. and they were all had degradation, and all of those contributors for each of the items had extensive degradation. The degradation reflects how the DNA was chopped up over the 3-year time period. If somebody left fresh DNA on those items, we wouldn't expect their DNA to be degraded. So instead of seeing a fall off of the signals of each person as the data disappears, as the DNA molecules become longer, there'd be more of a sustained signal, and we would see more of a recent deposition, like a contaminant DNA, even for the larger DNA sentences off to the right. We didn't see that. So in this case, I wouldn't expect contamination because there was no evidence in the data of non-degraded DNA.
So based on what you saw on the results, would it be your interpretation that the DNA analysis peaks that you observed and analyzed through TrueAllele are the remnants of DNA that were on the items when they were placed into the grave after they were recovered?
Well, they were either on the items or near the items. They're severely degraded. There's still information there, but they would be from a time further in the past where they could have experienced a lot of chopping up or degradation of the DNA molecules.
And there's something that came up during the cross-examination yesterday that I want to follow up on. So, since you're a medical doctor and you're familiar with decomposition of body, there's a body in the grave, and it starts to decompose, and there's decomposition of fluids, and what happens is the enzymes and bacteria that are normally in our body, and the enzymes and bacteria that can be in the soil, will all start to break down the
Objection,
the body.
leading, counsel testifying.
Overruled.
They'll start to break down the molecules of the body of the victim that's placed in the ground. Would that be fair summary?
Yes, they would all be contributing different enzymes that would chop up proteins and DNA.
So the actual DNA could be detected from the decomposition fluids. Would you expect any of that to really survive once the decomposition is complete?
It would, no. I mean, it's a process where the materials disappear, and published studies about what DNA is recoverable from decomposed bodies show that the DNA in the nucleus, which is what's tested by these short-tandem repeat methods, disappears. There's other DNA that wasn't tested that's inherited from mothers that's in this cell. So some DNA is left, but it's not the DNA that's tested for identification. So we wouldn't expect that to be left.
So the fact that all the items that recovered from the grave did not have the DNA from the 4 victims whose bodies were put in the grave, since all the bodies were fully decomposed, it's not surprising to you that their DNA is not present based on like a contamination by decomposition fluid.
The absence of their DNA is not surprising.
It's safe to say, based on the time they're in the ground, it's kind of almost expected.
Based on published studies on how bodies decompose and measuring identification DNA, yes.
Now, the fact that DNA was recovered from the items when they were processed, is that consistent with that DNA being touch DNA?
It could be touch DNA as DNA left from the surface of skin or fingers. It could be touch DNA, it could be a fluid, it could be blood, it could be sweat, saliva, whatever it was DNA that was degraded but survived in part over the 3-year period.
And the likelihood of any DNA surviving in that grave would depend on it not coming in contact with the decomposition fluid. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, it would depend on how protected the DNA was from that chopping up of DNA environment.
So if the body's decomposing here, just in an area, and there's something wrapped around the body, but a loose end is not near the body anymore, and it's through the dirt and it trails off. And it's theoretically doesn't come in contact with the fluid. If that happens, there is a chance that if there's any touch DNA on that part that's not coming in contact with fluid, could have survived.
It would depend to what extent it was in the soil. It wouldn't be part of the DNA degradation from the enzymes from the body's decomposition fluid, but if it's exposed to the soil, there might be still some degradation. DNA doesn't survive that well in the soil. It would depend what the consistency of the soil was, or if it was on the surface. So it could survive, but it could also not be there.
Now, obviously decomposition fluid has bacteria and enzymes that will break down DNA. We covered that, correct?
Yes.
How about urine? Does that have bacteria and enzymes that also can break down DNA?
Well, the urine's mainly made of urea that would break down into ammonia. If a person had an infection, it could have a lot of bacteria, but typically it would be more sterile.
Would that break down the DNA as well?
It would create a less neutral acid-base environment that was more basic rather than acidic, and that could accelerate DNA decomposition. But there's a lot going on already without the urine.
And you said urine breaks down to ammonia. Is ammonia a bleaching agent?
Yes, it is.
So if I can have computer 4 show you exhibit 247. Those are pants that an individual is wearing and urinating while they're wearing them. Would the pattern be consistent with urination, for one?
Objection calls for speculation.
Overruled, he can answer if he has an opinion.
Is that the end of the question?
Yes.
Yes, if someone urinated and they were standing up by gravity, the fluid would or could go down the side of the pants to the bottom, and over time the urine would turn into ammonia, which is a bleaching agent.
Now, there was discussion yesterday with you on cross-examination about the listing of all the locations by item, and they listed every allele, what would you call that? I guess a marker location, 14, 14.2, whatever it is. For each location, they were showing an allele height. You remember going through that part of your report. It started in the 60s, it was going into the hundreds, and it was breaking down each location.
I was shown a lot yesterday. Is this the CODIS search table? Is it?
No, this is the analysis from cybergenetics where you're taking the raw data and you're measuring the peak heights for every location for every item. And they were talking about, well, this one's a 7 and this one's a 7. So why is this one here and this one not here? You talk about the probabilities.
Yes, so in the case packet, there's a listing for each item that was analyzed at each data location of numbers that include which allele it was and how tall the peak was corresponding to that allele. I think that's the table you're referring to.
Yes, that table, that part of your report. And then you talked about there's different groupings for the DNA. You start calling them paragraphs and different things, like where the shorter DNA strands were on the left, and then the sloping effect would go to the right, and those were longer, and those degrade easier.
Yes, I was shown pictures like that yesterday.
If looking at the location or the locus that's at the far left, that has the shortest allele of all that part of the run, like some people call it the purple run, the red run. If we look at that first one, and we look at the longest allele, or tallest allele, peak, from your analysis, are you able to do that? I was to ask you to do that for certain items.
I think you're asking is that if we're looking at the shorter DNA molecules that weren't cut and still produce a signal, as opposed to the longer ones that had more cuts, and with one cut they can't produce a signal. I think you're asking, can I look at data from the shorter fragments that did produce a tall peak and answer a question about that?
Yes.
Okay.
Are you able to do that?
Yes.
Okay. If we want to look at item E01 at the locus D3, which I think is the shortest one in that first group, could you give a page reference so
Yes, let me
Molly can follow along?
Yes, let me open up that file.
I just wanted that file here on the page that you could tell me to go to.
So for E01 as that item at locus T3, if you turn to page 34 of the case packet, there's a listing of the different peaks that were detected, how the alleles they would correspond to if they're actual alleles, and the heights.
I had an operator error. Is it 34?
Yes, page 34.
Okay. Which allele is the highest peak?
So looking at all of the peaks for D3, the largest number is 64, which corresponds to allele 18.
And at D3, 18, is that included in any of the known samples as a allele marker for any of the victims of Mr. Merrick?
I can check. For D3, not for Joseph McStay Sr., his genotype is a 15-17. D3, not for Summer McStay, her genotype at D3 is a 15-15. It wasn't tested for the first child, so we don't know. For the second child, the D3 genotype is a 15-17, which doesn't have an 18 in it. And for the defendant, Charles Merritt, his genotype allele pair at D3 from the reference sample is a 14-15. So the answer to your question is no. The allele 18, that's the tallest peak seen in the data for item E01, is not seen in any of the reference samples.
Would the fact that the highest peak at the shortest DNA strand at that location, the fact that it is excluded from all parties, is that consistent with a probabilistic genotyping of an exclusionary result? That's something that seems would be consistent with that final calculation.
Yes, because what's happening is when the computer is listing all 100 possibilities, it's seeing that there's strong support for that 18 allele being present, and so the probability shifts to allele pairs that have an 18 in them. I mean, not all the allele pairs have to have an 18, but the probability is now more concentrated on those answers that have an 18, and therefore the probability is reduced in a similar fashion for the genotypes that don't have an 18, roughly speaking. And so when a comparison is made, the match statistic would be statistically exclusionary at that locus. So yes, the statistical probabilistic genotyping approach would express it in numbers, but it would produce statistics that would indicate that a reference sample, the person who had that reference sample didn't leave their DNA.
Let's look at the same location, same idea on item E5. See what the highest peak was. Can you tell us a page?
I'm looking. So for item E5, you'd want to turn to pages 77 and 78 for the data that was collected.
Okay, for D3, what was the highest peak?
The tallest allele was D3 for that item was 16, which had a height of 590, and there are no other peaks present that have a height over 50. So it's a very tall peak compared with the other ones. It also corresponds to a relatively short DNA sentence. Its length is 126 letters long. The range goes from about a little under 100 to over 400. So at a size of around 125, that's a much shorter sentence and less likely to be chopped by an enzyme that's degrading DNA.
And 16, as you reviewed the profile for all the knowns, is not included, correct?
I'll check and just give you a yes or no answer instead of...
I wrote down what you said. Joseph had a 15-17, Summer had a 15-15, and Charles Merritt had a 14-15. So those don't include 16, right?
Correct.
So that, again, consistent with an exclusionary probabilistic genotyping finding.
Yes, it would be expressed as a statistical number, but it would give an exclusionary statistic most often.
And let's do the same thing for item E08. Same location.
Their D3 is found on pages 109 and 110.
So if we look at this item, is it true that the highest peak for D3 on EO8 is the number 15 at 110, and 16 is the second highest at 85, right behind it?
Yes, the allele 15 has a height of 110, and the allele 16, that peak in the data, has a height of 85.
16 again is prominent in that item at that location as well.
Yes.
Instead of showing you how 16 shows up on all of them, let's just shorten it up. Let's go to D8 and start with item EO1 again, which would be the shortest allele in the second line of the analysis on the electroparagraph.
Okay, item EO1, locus D8. Those alleles and heights are provided on pages 35 and 36 of the case packet.
So on page 36,
Are you near page 36?
yeah, I was wrong. In the wrong item. E3, not E1, I'm sorry. I was at the wrong item. I know for an error.
Should I just tell you what it is?
On E3, on that D8, what is the tallest peak?
Oh, I thought you asked for E1, but
Yeah, I was on the wrong item. My notes were incorrect.
you wanted for E1 or E3?
E3.
Hold on. Okay, for item E3 at locus D8 on page 65, the tallest peak is a 12 allele, which is about 144 DNA letters long, with a peak height of 111 RFU, relative fluorescent units. And the next highest peak right near it is a 14, which is about 150 DNA letters long in that sentence, and that's has a height of 107 RFU.
The highest one, 12. Is 12 listed at that location for any of the victims or for the defendant?
check again. You wouldn't happen to have a list of them,
I do.
and I wouldn't have to keep checking.
Is it marked somewhere?
Thank you.
That list look familiar?
Yes, I've seen it before. It's a listing of the reference profiles at every location. At locus D 8, there's no 12 allele present in any of the 4 reference samples that have a genotype.
And would that be consistent again with the exclusionary statistic that was reached by running the samples through 2 alleles?
Yes, and that it would reduce the match statistic at that locus if there wasn't support in the data for the reference allele pair.
So as to not bore this jury, probably. Not bore them. I asked you to look through all this, didn't I?
Excuse me?
I asked you to look through this last night to kind of verify it. A lot of the higher peaks are listed as excluded from the known sample, correct?
Yes, though I wasn't looking for exclusions. What I did is I looked at the effect on the probability of the allele pairs that corresponded to the different references, as well as what was found in the data. And then I looked at the match statistics at every locus, and they were generally almost always reduced.
In layman's terms, a lot of the highest peaks for the different shorter locations were allele markers that are not contained within the victims of the defendant's profile.
Yes, the higher peaks move the probability of genotypes to other allele pairs that were different from those of the reference samples.
So based on the data you're seeing, just looking at the raw data, comparing it visually just to the profiles of the known, that data and that comparison generally match the statistical results that were achieved through running all the samples and doing the probabilistic phenotyping that you did with true allele targeting.
Yes, those two perspectives are consistent.
And did you review or note the quantification for the DNA that was found at each location?
In terms of what the laboratory found,
Correct.
I don't have that in front of me.
I'm going to inform you what was testified to by the laboratory technician that provided the test. Can you tell me if this is considered a lot of DNA or a little? For example, for sample E01, quantification for a human DNA is, they just rated it as less than 0.001. Would that be a lot of DNA? Nanograms per milliliter.
No, that's a very small amount of DNA.
And he said no male. So I assume there's just none.
Well, the test can indicate a small amount or indicate none. The tests aren't perfect, so there could be something present in a small amount, even if the test is saying none.
On sample E03, quantitative analysis for human DNA was 0.00128 nanograms per milliliter. That's a small amount.
Just say the number again, 0.0.
0.00128.
Yes, that's a small amount, a very small amount of DNA.
And he said none detected for male DNA.
So that would either mean there's none or there's a very, very small amount.
For E05, both human and male were less than 0.001. That's how they categorize it.
That again is a very small amount of DNA.
On E08, human is less than 0.001.
which is a very small amount of DNA.
None were detected for male. And example, or sample E09, for human it was 0.00442 nanograms per milliliter.
A 0.00 anything would still be a very small amount of DNA in terms of nanograms per microliter.
And the male, they said, was less than 0.001.
These are all very small amounts of DNA.
We're talking just specks.
Well, you have to also ask about the test. At that very small level, it's a small amount of DNA, but that number 0.001 could be affected by other factors, DNA inhibitors, so it could be a little bit more, but regardless, it would still be very small.
And that is the type of low-level DNA that cybernetics and true allele is really designed for, that human interpretation can't work with that.
Well, actually, it's designed for the easy cases too, but that's typically not what people send us.
You could do both, right? Businessman wants business, right?
No, actually, the easy ones can be done by eye, but the point of the computer is to remove people from the process of interpretation, either to accelerate the process so people can do something more useful, or to look deeper at what people can't solve in the first place.
So this small amount is consistent with something, processing something that's covered in touch DNA, or is this something that maybe you just came across a lucky spot that might have had just a little bit left that didn't degrade?
It's just a small amount of DNA.
And the CODIS entry table that we went over, how long would that take to enter into a system for a one-time search, do you think?
If the file were entered as a computer file, that would take maybe 5 minutes. If somebody had to retype all those numbers in and double check they didn't make a mistake, maybe 10 or 15 minutes.
Now, the last thing I just want to cover is you were crossed on the fact that you run a business and you try and sell a product, right?
Yes, that's why crime labs are able to use it and analyses can be done.
Do you have employees to pay?
We have about 10 employees, and you can go on, do they have families, do they go to college? Yes, it's a business.
It's kind of the American way, right? Design something, do a patent, and try and sell it.
Objection, argumentative.
I agree with him, so I wouldn't disagree.
Objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
One second, Your Honor. Note real quick. And just to clarify, the CODIS allele list that you made, do you have access to CODIS?
No, I don't.
Is that only a government ran database?
Yes, it's different in different countries, but in the U.S., it's run by the FBI, and laboratories have to meet. They have to be government laboratories at the national, state, or local level, and they have to satisfy FBI guidelines like accreditation and other standards. But there are no private sector laboratories that can upload to CODIS in the U.S. that I know of.
Now, since most of your business was with prosecution, correct?
About 90%.
Most of the time you do your analysis, you try and assist in identifying a perpetrator of an act.
No, the question we're asked is, here's evidence, it's DNA, it's complex, and typically there are references to compare with. Sometimes you don't get the references till later on. And the question is to what extent are the different people corresponding to the references present or not present? We're not asked to help one side or the other. People don't have to hire us after we give them the answer they don't like, but which happens a lot. But the question is, who's there, who's not there?
Have you ever provided that allele list to a prosecution agency for them to search for a match? As part of a contract.
We've provided those types of database search lists to police agencies who then
Objection lacks foundation, calls for hearsay.
the answer is yes. We have provided to police agencies. I'm trying to think of any instance that was a prosecution agency that wanted to do a search, but I'm not thinking of one.
So it was always the investigator.
Right, it's usually investigators or wrongful conviction groups that are they're on the two sides of investigation, one on the prosecution side, one on the defense side.
And have you been informed whether or not the format to which you provide those allele lists are compatible with doing the search?
Yes, they are. They've been tested in crime labs. And crime labs that have true allele do use those data lists and to conduct searches. They can be typed in. There's also different export file formats that True Allele provides if somebody would like that for CODIS database searches.
Is it fair to say all you're trying to do in this case is just give information?
Objection argument.
Sustained.
Nothing.
Anything else?
Yes. You indicated that True Allele is there to take people out of the process.
From the calculating part of calculating a match statistic, yes.
Part of calculating a match statistic is to go through the data counted with you at several locations.
An operator will look at the data and generally just upload the data that's provided into the computer and start asking questions.
And so the operator's putting the data in. They want to have as much information as they can about the data. Don't they?
An operator would like to generally use as much of the data as they can, which, based on the protocols that we have that we've tested, is basically all of the informative data that is analyzed from the electropharogram peaks.
So it's analyzing data, and I guess my question was, you want to know as much as you can about the data.
We want to know as much as we can about what the data tells us about information that can change genotype probabilities. That's the task of the system.
Council showed you item E03 at the D3 locus, page 77, in the case report.
Okay, I'll go there.
Can I have my computer, please? Okay, are you there, doctor?
Yes, I am.
And he asked you at the D3 locus here what the largest piece, paragraph, whatever was, right?
What the allele was that corresponded to the tallest peak height.
And the tallest peak height here is 590 R.
That's the height, correct?
Are you aware that Bodie considered that to be bacterial DNA?
No, I'm not.
You use that to factor into
Objection,
your...
misstates the testimony.
Were you given Bodie's lab notes?
We were given reports that we generally use for the purpose of knowing what the names of items are, so we know what we're looking at. We don't usually read those reports, and we don't rely on them in any way.
Okay. I said E3 is actually item E05 at locus.
Okay.
Well, and so that was used to show that, well, look, the largest one is 590 and it's a 16, and there's nobody in the known samples that's a 16.
Yes, that's what the lawyer was trying to show.
That's what the lawyer was trying to show. The lawyer didn't tell you, and you were never made aware, that Bodie concluded that that was a bacterial piece.
Objection, misstates the testimony, Your Honor. And we can approach just to clarify what's
Sure, counsel approach. All right, the last objection is sustained as to the form of the question, and you may continue.
Were you made aware that Bodie found the data to be bacterial? Bacterial piece.
Not that I know.
That 590 is significantly higher than anything else in the record data.
Yes, which is why at locus the computer would have concentrated more probability based on that data that was given.
So the computer's going to look and concentrate more because it has a significantly higher peak than a lot of people, all the other peaks, really.
Certainly at that location, yes.
Did you find any other peaks that were that big?
I haven't looked over the whole profile. I can.
Okay. Okay.
No, that was the tallest peak across all of the loci for that item.
For that. And were you made aware that on 3 items they found that they were to be bacterial?
I don't know. I know that there were 3 peaks that our analysts removed because they didn't appear to be real data.
But you don't know if those are the same peaks, assuming Bodie accounted for that at all.
No, I don't know that.
And in any event, the computer's still going to look at that and give it a lot of weight because it's very high. It's going to give it a lot more probability.
Yes, that's what happened at the D3 locus at E5, though ultimately it didn't make any difference in terms of what the match statistic concluded, because that difference of a factor of 100 wouldn't have changed the results that were exclusionary either way.
This is based on probabilities. I mean, I think we've got that. It's based on what they call Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm.
There's a lot of ideas in that question. All DNA analysis is based on probabilities because there's a ratio of two probabilities. Older style, just the denominator, the bottom part, was using population probabilities to determine rarity. And then in order to calculate probabilities of matches or genotypes that were less than one, probability equations were introduced. And when the equations got more intricate, yes, a method like Markov chain Monte Carlo was used to solve for the probability of the numerator, which was accounting for a data uncertainty.
And you testified earlier yesterday on direct. This data, because, well, let me ask you this. I'll withdraw that question. That same kind of algorithm is used in a lot of different things. It's used in Google. It's used on the phone when they ask you, say what your problem is, get you text support, that kind of thing.
It's used on Wall Street. It's used basically anywhere where there's uncertainty, there's data, and scientists or social scientists want more information from that data in a way that can quantify the uncertainty and give answers.
And if I garble some language into a phone that's trying to listen to what I'm saying, it'll either send me to the wrong department or say I didn't hear that right.
Yeah, or more likely cancel your flight reservation.
Exactly, that happens too.
Yeah.
Because the data going into it's garbled.
Well, actually, that's interesting. The whole theory of information theory, on which much of these likelihood ratios and statistics come from, was originally developed by scientists at Bell Laboratories, who were concerned about the question you ask: what happens when there's more and more noise on a phone line, and how much information can be preserved in the presence of more and more noise? So these methods actually started, part of them were developed in the 1940s to make sure that the phone transmissions were secure, even in the face of noisy channels.
I guess what I'm really trying to get at here is that to some extent you are looking at the data, and to other extent you're looking at the data and drawing inferences from the data.
Yes, in a validated, reliable way. That's correct.
Validated, reliable. I didn't mean to suggest that. In a validated, reliable way, you're looking at data and you're drawing inferences from the data.
That's correct.
And sometimes, like we saw yesterday with 23 and 24, the probabilities don't favor the 24 at that particular location, so it's not really accounted for. It's accounted for, but not in as great a probability as 23. So in other words, 23 and 24 yesterday, and I don't recall the locus, the data was pretty close. And you can correct me, I'm sure you will if I'm wrong. 23 has a higher probability, so 23 was selected by the computer.
I don't recall the example.
No. I called yesterday, and the 23 and 24, and we looked at the peak heights. They were the same, the lengths were almost the same. Can you recall that?
You asked a lot of questions, and we went through data tables and match tables and all sorts of things.
But if the data is essentially the same, the computer's going to pick the one with the highest probability.
The data, I think you mean peak height.
Sure.
So when the height in the data of certain alleles expresses a higher quantity, that will push the computer towards giving it more probability. It may or may not end up with allele pairs that have higher probability. That depends on how the patterns are explained, but generally it does, yes.
Finally, you were asked questions about CODIS. I can't just go create DNA results in a lab and give them to a government lab to run the CODIS. Fair?
Probably not. You're not a.
Do you know or do you not?
You're a prosecutor, so I don't know what you would be doing, creating stuff in a lab.
Well, let's just say I have a degree in science, and I did it in my garage, and I have some results, and I want to submit it to San Bernardino County. That doesn't work, right?
You definitely couldn't upload it to a DNA database to be checked continuously forever. How a lab might respond to doing a speculative search or a keyboard search would depend on the lab's policies. I don't know the policies.
And you don't know the FBI standards for labs that perform analysis of DNA to submit to labs for coders.
I've read them, but I also know there's more flexibility on one-time keyboard searches, and labs have more discretion.
And that requires the lab who's actually going to do the search to conduct site audits of the lab that's submitting the data. Right?
Again, I don't know the detailed rules for one-time keyboard searches. I know they're more flexible.
The question was,
Yes.
are there requirements for a lab who's conducting DNA analysis for the government lab to accept that data to upload it to CODIS or do any search? Do you know?
Yes, there are requirements for labs that I know are in place for permanent uploads. That I know.
Do you know that I requested anything to show that you're in compliance with those rules?
We're not. I don't think. I think you're asking about the rules for one-time keyboard searches, and you're also simultaneously asking about uploads. So whatever we produced, if we didn't have a partner lab, you would not be able to be uploaded permanently. I don't know what your lab policies are for one-time keyboard searches, which is different.
Where in the FBI standards is there a distinction drawn?
Again, where's there?
Where in the FBI lab director standard for quality assurance is there a distinction drawn that you're drawing right now?
I'm aware that I can't find it for you, but I know that people from crime labs have called the NDIS director and asked if they could do a one-time keyboard. I'm trying to answer your question.
Overruled.
So,
My question was,
Your Honor, I would ask to let him finish the question, his answer.
He can finish explaining his answer.
so I'm aware of circumstances where keyboard searches have been conducted and permission was granted. So I don't know the details of whether the standards are the same for a permanent search that stays in the database as for a one-time keyboard search.
okay, so my question was, where in the FBI quality director assurance standards does it say there's a distinction?
I probably can't point that for you.
So you're just aware of circumstances where it's been done?
I'm aware of a lot more than that. I'm aware of that the results that we're producing through partner laboratories can be uploaded and so on. But specifically, do I know where in the quality assurance standards for DNA database searches from the FBI, do they talk about the applicability to keyboard searches? I don't know exactly where that would be.
Is it fair to say that your science is good, but it may not matter much depending on the facts?
Absolutely. I mean, there are cases where somebody can leave DNA where it's totally expected, and if you find that someone's DNA is present on their own toothbrush in their own home, that doesn't mean that they killed anybody in their own home because you'd expect it to be there. So that's perfectly true.
And with this particular DNA, you can't tell how long prior to the 3 years, 9 months it was placed on that.
That's correct.
Oh, yeah. Can you put that, this one's up here? I'm almost. Ammonia is a bleaching agent.
Yes.
It is.
Excuse me?
It is.
Yes.
They're urinated pants.
I don't know.
You don't know if they did or not?
I remember the toilet training, and they went from diapers into pants. So,
They ever bleach out their clothes?
no, my kids didn't.
Familiar with your medical doctor, female anatomy. It's common for a woman to be standing, it's common for urine to just drip primarily down one way.
Anything's possible. I don't know. It depends how she was standing, how she was wearing clothing, and typically the clothing wouldn't be buried for 3 years either.
Okay. I guess you don't know whether it's based on female anatomy or whether it's common for them to urinate down one way.
I haven't done any studies on that.
Thank you.
Anything else, Mr. Dean?
Just two questions. Well, two things. When urine breaks down into ammonia, how long does that take? 15 minutes or longer?
It's longer than 15 minutes.
Approximately, are we talking hours, days, months, or years?
It would be days to weeks. It would not be years. It wouldn't be hours.
So if you have a baby and they urinate in their pants, unless you let it sit in a closet for a month, you just wash them. It's not going to bleach it from ammonia, would that be fair to say?
Right, a better experiment would actually be taking pants and pouring ammonia down the pants and to do a controlled experiment and see what happened.
Now, there was the question about that allele marker at D3 on EO5. I'm going to show you, which you previously marked, Exhibit 1019, I believe, which is the electroparograms as produced by Bodie on that item at that location. There was discussion of an artifact and an allele. The artifact and an allele. Is the 16 that you show on your data list inconsistent with the allele called on Exhibit 1019 by Bodie?
I don't have one of the numbers written down. Let me just check. Yes, it is. It's the same item, the same locus of around the same length for the same allele of around the same height.
Now your length and the height are not exactly the same. Your data says 590, theirs says 611. Does the software used to analyze the data, would that cause that variance?
Yes, there's different software that analyzes the data peaks, the electropharogram raw data, in order to determine what the heights are, where the baseline is, and also the relative sizing. So they're essentially equivalent across the different types of software that are used.
But not going to always be the exact same number?
No, they're slightly different algorithms.
Nothing further.
Anything else?
No. Thank you, Your Honor.
I wanted to clarify one or two things. On the right cup of the bra, which I think is item A26,
Yes.
what assumption was made as to how many potential contributors there were to the samples on that?
Let me check. It's in the case book. For item EO9, which corresponds to that item that you mentioned, true allele was processed assuming 2 contributors, 3 contributors, and 4 contributors. So each computer run will have an assumed number of contributors, but if we don't know, then we do it at different numbers in order to account for the fact that we don't know with certainty.
And what leads you to make the assumptions of either 2, 3, or 4 contributors?
It's based on the peak data. If you see more peaks, that could indicate more alleles. That indicates there are more individuals present. But you'll also see some locations, some tests that exhibit more alleles and others that exhibit fewer. We document that in our notes.
Okay. So how about the left cup of the bra, which, according to my notes, was item A3, but it's probably an EO something.
Left cup was EO3.
Okay. And how many contributors were sitting in that?
I just moved between documents. So for EO3, we ran it assuming both 2 contributors and 3 contributors.
Okay. And then the white cord, which might have been as E11, but I don't know if that.
I have E15 is the electrical cord, which is also called EO1.
Okay. And how many contributors were assumed in that?
We ran it assuming 2 contributors as well as 3 contributors.
Okay. And the red strap,
Your Honor, just for the court's information, there was 2 white cords. E05 was also E11, which was the other part that came out.
okay. So the other white cord?
Okay, so for EO5, that was run assuming 2 and 3 contributors.
Okay, so both of them. And then the red strap, which I have it as A25, but it's again covered by EO.
So it's an EO8.
Okay.
And there we had the computer analyze the data assuming both 2 and 3 unknown contributors.
Okay. So all of them were two or 3 contributors except for the right cup, which was one for 2, 3, and 4 possible contributors.
Yes.
So there were more higher peaks on the right cup.
Or there were more peaks that were seen in total.
Okay. And if I understand your testimony correctly, you did not do an analysis of saying, okay, there's a major contributor, here's the DNA profile of the major contributor. there's a minor contributor, here's the DNA profile of the minor contributor, there's one or two trace contributors, here's the DNA profile of the trace contributor. You did not do that.
No, we had the computer assume 2 or 3 or 4 contributors, look at the data, and then tell us what each of those contributors' genotype was up to probability, separating them all simultaneously.
Right. And for the individual loci where you got results on each of those items, you did not get a particular genotype where you had what the actual pairs were. Is that right?
We have a listing of, say, all 100 possible pairs,
Right.
and with that list was associated probabilities that added up to 1.
Okay. But I mean, like in the easier cases where the peaks are, sometimes you can look at it and say, okay, I can determine a DNA profile of a particular contributor.
Absolutely. There are cases where you may have a 2-person mixture. The victim's DNA is 75%. The unknown is 25%. The computer figures that out, and it can give essentially 100% probability to that minor component.
Right.
And there's only one large probability on the list associated with an allele pair, and the rest are essentially 0. So with simpler data, that's what the computer does.
Okay, I got you. Okay, that's all I have. I don't know if council
Thank you.
had any additional.
No, Your Honor. There you go.
Any objections to Dr. Coleman being excused?
Subject to recall just in case. I don't think it will.
Okay, thank you, sir, for your attendance, and you are excused. Make sure you don't take any of our exhibits with you.
I know I won't. Thank you.
And do you have the next witness here?
We do not, since it's only morning, and I didn't know if you'd go through morning.
Sure. And we indicated we would not be in session this afternoon, so we will resume on Monday morning at 9:30 in the morning. And keep in mind the admonitions previously reviewed and to express any opinions on the case and to discuss the case or allowing you to discuss the case with you in your presence. Really inside the wrestling of the case, and the witnesses, testimony, exhibits, parties or attorneys, and we'll start them back.